$5,000. That was the price her father put on her life because she couldn't hear him ask for a beer. Sapphire didn't hear the words he screamed at the buyer, but she saw the spit flying from his lips and the greedy way he clutched the envelope. She was 23, deaf, and being sold like cattle in a meatpacking warehouse. But when the buyer stepped out of the shadows, he didn't look at the money. He looked at her hands. Her father shoved her into the center of the room like a sack of unwanted flour. His face was a twisted mask of red rage, veins bulging in his neck. Sapphire watched his mouth move, saw the spittle fly from his cracked lips as he screamed into the shadows. She didn't need sound to know what he was saying. She had memorized the shape of his cruelty years ago. Broken goods, useless, burden. He waved a wad of crumpled cash in one hand and pointed a trembling finger at her ears with the other, mocking her, shaking his head. He was selling his own daughter because she couldn't hear him ask for another beer. Suddenly, the vibrations on the floor stopped. The dust motes dancing in the harsh light beams seemed to freeze. A man stepped out of the darkness. Dante Corso, the Capo of Shadows. He wore a suit that cost more than Sapphire's entire life, and his eyes were cold enough to freeze the blood in her veins. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. Her father laughed nervously, expecting the buyer to inspect her like cattle. "She's deaf," the old man sneered, the words clear on his lips. "But she's pretty enough if you don't need conversation." Dante didn't look at the father. He looked at Sapphire's bound hands. Then he looked at her terrified eyes. Slowly, deliberately, Dante raised his right hand. Her father flinched, shielding his face, expecting a blow. Sapphire squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the pain. But it never came. When she opened her eyes, the monster wasn't striking her. His fingers were moving, forming shapes, precise, gentle, H.I. He wasn't hitting her. He was signing to her. She thought she was being sold to a monster. She didn't know he was the only one who wanted to hear her voice. If you believe love needs no words, hit that like button and subscribe, because Sapphire's silent war is just beginning. Sapphire's father blinked, his mouth hanging open like a fish gasping for air. He didn't understand the fingers. To him, silence was a defect, not a language. "I said 5,000. The old man spat, stepping forward to haggle. A shadow moved. Dante's bodyguard didn't speak. He simply stepped between them, his hand hovering over the bulge in his jacket. The father froze. The air left the room. Dante reached into his coat. He didn't hand the money to the father. He dropped a thick, heavy envelope onto the dirty concrete floor. "Her debt," he said, his voice low enough to rattle the floorboards Sapphire stood on. "Bought, gone." Dante turned to Sapphire. A switchblade clicked open in his hand. She flinched, her breath hitching in her throat, preparing for the cut. The cold steel grazed her wrist, but there was no pain, only the sudden release of pressure. The ropes fell away to the ground. He had cut her bonds, not her skin. He motioned for her to follow. The black SUV waiting outside was a tank disguised as a luxury car. Inside, the silence was suffocating. Sapphire pressed herself against the door, waiting for the demand. Men like him didn't buy women for charity, but Dante didn't touch her. He simply opened a file folder and began to read, ignoring her completely. Sapphire watched him through her lashes. His hands were scarred, the knuckles thick with white lines of healed violence. A tattoo of a black wolf snarled on the side of his neck. Suddenly, he looked up. He caught her staring. He didn't smile. He put down the file, raised a scarred hand, and tapped his chest. Then he pointed to her. Then he clasped his hands together in a protective shell. "Me, you safe." It was broken, clumsy sign language, like a child learning to speak. But he was trying. The car slowed. Heavy iron gates groaned shut behind them. Sapphire looked out the window at a fortress of gray stone surrounded by men with assault rifles. Her heart sank. She hadn't been rescued. She had just been transferred to a much more dangerous cage. The interior of the Corso estate was colder than the Chicago winter outside. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture, glass, steel, and marble, but it felt completely dead. No music played. No servants bustled through the halls. It was a silent mausoleum built for a king without a court. Dante led her to a bedroom that was larger than her father's entire apartment. The silk sheets and velvet curtains felt alien to her rough hands. He didn't stay. He pulled a small notepad from his pocket, scribbled 2 lines, tore off the page, and pressed it into her palm. Don't open the front door. Don't go into the east wing. He turned and left, the heavy door clicking shut. Sapphire was alone. Nervous energy buzzed under her skin. She paced the room, her fingers trailing over the expensive furniture. She turned too quickly. Her hip bumped a marble pedestal. She didn't hear the crash, but she felt it. A violent vibration shot up through the floorboards as a Ming vase shattered into 1,000 pieces. Sapphire froze. Her heart stopped. Old instincts took over. She dropped to her knees, curling into a tight ball, wrapping her arms over her head. She waited for the blow. She waited for the boot. The door flew open. Dante stormed in, a black pistol raised in a 2-handed grip, eyes scanning for an assassin. He stopped dead. There was no attacker, just a terrified girl on the floor, trembling among the porcelain shards, shielding herself from a beating that wasn't coming. Dante holstered the weapon. The anger drained from his face, replaced by something softer. He walked over, the crunch of glass beneath his shoes vibrating the floor. He knelt down, forcing himself to be smaller than her. He reached out not to strike, but to take her hands. He turned them over, checking her palms for cuts, completely ignoring the fortune in broken antique pottery scattered around them. He stood up, brushed the glass from his knees, and walked out without a word of blame. But as the door swung shut, Sapphire's gaze drifted down the hallway toward the forbidden east wing. A shadow moved across the floor. Small, fast, too short to be a guard. A child. Midnight passed, but sleep wouldn't come. The image of that small shadow tugged at Sapphire's mind. Against every warning written on that notepad, she slipped out of her room. The hallway was a tunnel of darkness, but the door to the east wing was cracked open, leaking a sliver of pale moonlight. She pushed it open. The room was filled with toys, mountains of them, but they looked untouched, gathering dust like artifacts in a museum. Huddled under a massive mahogany desk was a boy. He looked about 8 years old. This was Leo. He held a tablet close to his chest, his eyes wide and hollow. He didn't speak when she entered. He didn't make a sound. Sapphire recognized that silence instantly. It wasn't that he couldn't hear, it was that he had chosen not to speak. She didn't try to pull him out. She didn't force a hello. Instead, she sat heavily on the floor, letting the moonlight catch her profile. She raised her hands and twisted her fingers against the light. A shadow rabbit hopped across the wall, then a bird. Leo lowered the tablet. He watched the wall, mesmerized. Sapphire turned to him. She formed her hand into a snout and ears. Wolf. She pointed to the tattoo she had seen on Dante's neck, then back to her hand. Wolf. Leo hesitated. Then slowly, his small fingers mimicked the shape. Wolf. For the first time in years, the boy had spoken, just not with his voice. Suddenly, the room flooded with harsh overhead light. Sapphire felt the vibration of heavy boots charging across the floor before she saw him. Dante stood in the doorway, chest heaving, his face twisted in panic and rage. He marched toward them, terrifying in his speed. He grabbed Sapphire's wrist, his grip like iron. Sapphire flinched, bracing to be thrown out for breaking the rules. But Dante didn't pull her away. He froze. He was staring down at Leo. The boy was looking up at his father, his fingers still curled in the shape of a wolf, a small, tentative smile breaking his stoic face. Dante's grip on Sapphire's wrist didn't loosen, but it changed. It wasn't aggression anymore. It was an anchor. He looked from his son's smile to Sapphire's terrified eyes, and for the first time, the Capo of Shadows looked like he was about to cry. 2 days later, the tension in the house was thick enough to choke on. Dante sat at the head of the long dining table, flanked by 3 men who smelled of cheap cologne and expensive cigars. These were his capos, the wolves at the door. Dante motioned for Sapphire to bring the coffee. It was a test. He wanted to see if she would break under the pressure of his world. The men barely glanced at her as she placed the porcelain cups on the table. To them, she was furniture. A deaf girl, a dumb girl, safe. They didn't stop talking as she poured the water. They didn't lower their voices. Why would they? She couldn't hear them. Sapphire kept her eyes down, playing the part. But as she moved behind Dante to refill his glass, her gaze caught the reflection in the dark window pane across the room. She could see Luca, the capo with the greasy mustache, leaning in toward the man on his right. His lips moved with practiced precision. "Tonight," Luca whispered. "At the docks. We hit him when the shipment arrives. He won't see it coming." The pitcher in Sapphire's hand trembled, water sloshing perilously close to the rim. She steadied herself. She had read the betrayal as clearly as if he had screamed it. Now she had a choice. If she warned Dante, she revealed that she wasn't just a helpless victim. She was observant, intelligent, and dangerous. That could get her killed. But if she stayed silent, the man who had saved her, the man who had cried over his son's smile, would be dead by sunrise. The meeting ended. The men left, clapping Dante on the shoulder with false loyalty. Dante sat alone in the empty room, rubbing his temples, exhausted. Sapphire stood by the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She couldn't let him die. She marched across the room, walked right up to the feared Mafia Don, and slammed her hand down on the mahogany table. The vibration made his coffee cup jump. Dante looked up, startled, his hand instinctively going for his gun. But he stopped when he saw the fire in her eyes. She had something to say. Dante stared at her hand on the table, then up at her face. He waited. Sapphire didn't have words, and she didn't have time to teach him sign language. She grabbed the salt shaker and placed it in the center of the table. Dante. She grabbed the pepper shaker and slammed it into the salt. Crash. Dante frowned, confused. Sapphire pointed to her own lip, puffed out her cheeks, and used her finger to draw a mustache. Then she pointed to the empty chair where Luca had been sitting. She made a gun with her hand, pressed it against the salt shaker, and mimed a trigger pull. Bang. Dante's eyes narrowed. The confusion vanished, replaced by a razor-sharp realization. He looked at the empty chair. He looked at her lips. Then he looked at her. The wolf woke up. She wasn't just watching, she was reading them. Ambush. 3 hours later, the docks exploded in gunfire. But this time, the prey was the predator. Dante's men were already in position. When Lucas signaled the attack, he walked straight into a kill box. It was brutal, efficient, and over in minutes. Sapphire watched from the back of the armored SUV, flinching as muzzle flashes lit up the dark harbor. Silence returned to the docks. The heavy door of the SUV swung open. Dante stood there, his white shirt ruined, blood splattered across his chest and hands. He looked terrifying, a demon of violence. But when he looked at Sapphire, there was no anger. There was only a cold, burning respect. He climbed in, wiped his bloody hands on a rag, and pulled a brand new burner phone from his jacket. He handed it to her. He had already installed a text-to-speech app. He typed, his fingers moving stiffly. "Who taught you to survive like this?" Sapphire took the phone. Her hands shook, but her thumbs were steady as she typed the truth. "The man who sold me." The adrenaline faded, leaving pain in its wake. Dante had taken a grazing shot to his ribs, shallow but bleeding heavily. He waved off his men and refused a doctor. In his world, a doctor was just another person who could be bought. He stumbled into the kitchen, clutching his side, his face pale. Sapphire was there, making tea to calm her nerves. She saw the blood seeping through his shirt. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She moved. She pushed him onto a stool and grabbed the first aid kit from the pantry. The silence in the kitchen wasn't heavy anymore. It was intimate. The only sounds were the running water and the hiss of sterile packaging being torn open. She cleaned the wound with efficient, gentle hands. Dante hissed as the alcohol touched raw skin, but he didn't pull away. He watched her face, focused and calm, so different from the terrified girl in the warehouse. As she began to wrap the gauze around his torso, he reached out and gently stopped her hand. With his other hand, he pulled a thin, paperback book from his back pocket. ASL for Beginners. He opened it to a dog-eared page. He pointed to her, then tapped the book. He wanted a lesson. He signed clumsily, "Pain." Sapphire corrected him, guiding his fingers to touch his thumb to his chin. "Pain." He nodded, watching her lips. Then he looked deep into her eyes, searching for something he hadn't found in years. He signed one more word. Trust. Sapphire's breath hitched. She slowly raised her hands, interlocking her fingers, showing him the unbreakable bond of the sign. Trust. Dante mimicked her. His hands were warm. His face was inches from hers. The air between them crackled with an electricity that had nothing to do with danger. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. Suddenly, the world turned red. A siren screamed through the house, a sound Sapphire felt as a jarring vibration in her teeth. Red emergency lights began to strobe, casting them into a nightmare of flashing shadows. The estate hadn't just been hit, it had been breached. Luca wasn't the only traitor. The wolves were inside the walls. The power cut with a mechanical clunk, plunging the estate into pitch blackness. The only light came from the erratic strobe of gunfire echoing from the foyer. Dante cursed, shoving Sapphire behind the kitchen island. He was blind. His men were shouting, their commands lost in the deafening roar of automatic weapons. But in the darkness, Sapphire wasn't helpless. She didn't need to hear the enemy, she could feel them. The floorboards vibrated with heavy, sprinting footsteps. 3 men, heading upstairs. Leah. Dante was pinned down by suppressing fire, unable to move. Sapphire didn't wait. She slipped off her shoes and vanished into the shadows. She moved like a ghost, her feet reading the house like a map. She reached the landing and felt the vibrations of a mercenary creeping toward Leo's door. She couldn't fight him, but she could hunt him. Sapphire grabbed a heavy marble bust from a hallway table. She waited until she felt the mercenary's boots pause. She hurled the statue down the main staircase. Crash. The vibration was massive. The mercenary spun around, firing blindly at the noise. The muzzle flash lit up his silhouette for a split second. Bang! Dante's single shot took him down. By the time Dante cleared the stairs, stepping over the body, he found Leo's room. The door was open. Sapphire was huddled in the corner, holding the terrified boy tight against her chest. Her hands were pressed firmly over Leo's eyes, shielding him from the violence, rocking him to a rhythm only she could feel. Dante pulled them up, ushering them toward the back exit. They burst out into the cold night air, sprinting toward the hidden garage. They were almost free. Then a figure stepped out from behind the armored car. Going somewhere, sweetheart. Sapphire skidded to a halt. It wasn't a mercenary. It was her father. He held a pistol with shaking hands, grinning a toothless, treacherous smile. He hadn't just sold her. He had sold the key to Dante's kingdom. Her father stood there, a pathetic king of betrayal, the gun in his hand shaking violently. His face was twisted in that familiar, ugly scream, veins popping as he shouted at Dante. Sapphire couldn't hear the words, but she read his lips perfectly. "You stole my property, she's mine to sell." Behind him, the enemy boss, a man in a gray suit, stepped into the light. He didn't look at Dante, he looked at Sapphire. "Simple choice," the man said, his words slow and exaggerated so she would catch them. "Come with us and the Mafia Don lives. Stay and we burn him and the boy right here." Sapphire looked at Dante. He was wounded, bleeding, and shielding his son. He shook his head violently, his eyes pleading with her not to do it. No. But Sapphire had been sold before. She knew the cost of survival. She looked Dante in the eye. She raised a single hand. She signed one word. Live. She stepped away from Dante, walking toward her father with her hands raised in surrender. Dante broke. He let out a roar so primal, so full of fury, that Sapphire felt it thump against her chest like a physical blow. He stepped out from cover, throwing his gun to the ground. He wouldn't let her go alone. He wouldn't let her be sold again. "Take me too," he screamed. The enemy boss smiled. "Deal." Before Sapphire could react, the butt of a rifle slammed into Dante's skull. Darkness took him. When the world came back, it was swaying. Sapphire blinked her eyes open. She was in the back of a moving van, zip-tied to a metal chair. Across from her, Dante was tied to the frame, blood trickling down his forehead. They were alive, but they were trapped in the dark, heading back to the nightmare she thought she had escaped. The van stopped. The doors flew open. They were dragged into another warehouse, a cruel mirror of where they had met. Dust, cold, darkness. They were tied to chairs in the center of the room. The enemy boss paced back and forth, monologuing about power and territory. He ignored Dante and Sapphire, treating them as already dead. Why worry about prisoners who couldn't speak to each other? He didn't know about the quiet nights in the kitchen. He didn't know about the book. Dante caught Sapphire's eye. His face was bruised, but his gaze was sharp. His hands were tied behind his back, but his fingers tapped against his thigh. Sapphire watched the rhythm. Wait. Left. Now. Sapphire slammed her heels into the metal table in front of her. Clang. The vibration rattled the teeth of everyone in the room. The guards flinched, turning toward the noise. In that split second of distraction, Dante twisted his wrist with a sickening pop. He had dislocated his thumb. He slipped his hand free, grabbed the guard's knife, and slashed the throat of the man nearest him. Chaos erupted. Dante moved like a blur of violence, a demon unleashed. He took the enemy boss down with 3 brutal punches and a stolen gun. Sapphire wasn't just watching. Her father, realizing the tide had turned, scrambled toward the exit like a rat. Sapphire thrust her legs out, tripping him. He sprawled onto the concrete, face first into the dirt. Silence fell, heavy, suffocating silence. The enemy boss lay dead. Dante stood over the bodies, chest heaving, blood dripping from his knuckles. Only one man was left. Sapphire's father cowered in the corner, sobbing, begging for mercy. Dante walked over. He picked up the pistol from the floor. He didn't shoot. He walked to Sapphire, cut her ties, and placed the cold steel of the gun into her hand. He looked at her, then raised his bloody hands to sign. Your debt. Your choice. The gun felt heavy in Sapphire's hand, a cold, mechanical weight of judgment. Her father was on his knees, his mouth moving in a frantic, ugly blur of apologies and promises. She didn't need to hear his lies. She could read the cowardice in his eyes. She looked at Dante, who stood silent, waiting for her to reclaim her soul. Sapphire didn't pull the trigger. Instead, she pressed the release. The magazine fell to the floor with a heavy thud. Then, she pulled back the slide, ejecting the single-chambered round. It spun through the air like a discarded coin. She dropped the empty weapon and raised her hands. He is not worth the noise. Dante's eyes softened, a look of pure pride washing over his face. He signaled to the guards who had finally stormed the perimeter. They grabbed her father, dragging him away into the darkness, not to a grave, but to a silent cell where he would never be heard from again. Weeks passed. The estate was no longer a tomb of glass and marble. Sunlight flooded the halls, and the sound of Leo's laughter, rare but growing, vibrated through the floors. The East Wing was no longer forbidden. It was a home. Dante found Sapphire on the balcony, watching the sunset over the Chicago skyline. He looked different. His sharp suit was unbuttoned, his gaze no longer guarded. For the first time, the Capo of Shadows looked nervous. He stepped in front of her, blocking the light. He raised his hands. His movements were fluid now, the clumsiness replaced by a deep, intentional grace. He signed, I never asked. Then he signed, what is your name? Sapphire's heart swelled. She had been called broken, deaf, and useless her entire life. But here, in the silence of his gaze, she finally had a voice. She raised her fingers and spelled it out, one letter at a time. Eliene. Dante smiled, a real true smile, and spelled back, D-A-N-T. He took her hand and placed it firmly on his chest, directly over his heart. Sapphire closed her eyes. She couldn't hear the world, but she could feel the steady, powerful rhythm of his love beating against her palm. She was sold into silence, but she found a love that roared. If this story touched your heart, comment Team Dante below and subscribe for more stories of second chances.